Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Trump's education secretary has been at her post for all of 3 days, but protesters are already using harassment to keep her from doing her job. We'll find out what's setting them off. Plus, we'll talk to a professor with a novel idea for fixing poverty in this country: give everyone a government job. But first, last week at NYU, rioters shut down a planned speech by Vice co-founder Gavin McInnes. Now, one student there is saying the speech's organizers ought to be punished for this provocation. In a piece written for Washington Square News, that's NYU's student newspaper, grad student Kuras Esmaili says the college Republicans ought to be kicked off campus for inviting McInnes to speak there. McInnes's beliefs, he says, quote, are beyond our sense of democratic values and debate, and therefore ought to be suppressed. Kuras Esmaili joins us tonight from New York. Mr. Esmaili, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker, for having me.
So, because this is kind of the crux of your argument, I want you to be a little more specific for us, if you could. You said that McInnes's point of view is, and I'm quote, beyond our sense of democratic values. What democratic values specifically are you referring to?
First of all, Tucker, I want to thank you very much for having me on. The reason I accepted to come on here is because what I wrote was actually altered and suppressed by the student paper, and I wrote them and they never wrote me back, but it really gave me a sense that I really need to have somewhere to where I can actually say what I believe rather than an editorial that actually decides to tell me, change my words. So I really appreciate the fact that you have me on and you're allowing me to sort of say it from my perspective.
We always do.
And I did some research on you today, and I really understand that you're a free speech fundamentalist. You believe free speech should be open and it should not be curbed at any point. Am I right about that?
I'm an American, but I'm trying to get to the core of your argument, which
is... See, my argument was suppressed, so I want to sort of like be able to sort of say
tell us, okay, then let's just make this really simple for our viewers who don't know the backstory here. Your op-ed that you wrote for this paper appears to suggest the Republicans at NYU should be sanctioned in some way for daring to have Gavin McInnes on campus, and your justification for that is that his views are so beyond the pale, beyond, as you put it, our democratic values, that we shouldn't be allowed to hear them.
See, Tucker, what I really don't want you to do is do what the student paper at NYU did, which is put words in my mouth and change my words.
Let's
let me sort of tell my own story. Is that okay?
Yes, with haste.
So what I'm trying to, one of the sentences that was actually taken out, which made me very angry, was the question: does the university, is it obliged to protect the speech of someone who comes on campus and advocates and recruits for Al-Qaeda?
Okay.
What do you think about that?
I don't know that is at question here. We're talking about Gavin McInnes.
It's exactly the question that I want to raise, which was suppressed. So I'm bringing that question. Another question that was altered is the question: should the university protect someone who comes on campus and advocates vigilante violence against police officers who've killed civilians and have not been indicted? Is that protected? Should that be protected on campus?
That was, I mean, look.
That was suppressed on, by those editors. And I want a place where I can sort of have this conversation. What do you think about this? Should someone who actually advocates killing police officers be allowed to debate on a campus, or no, not even debate, to sort of come on and say what they believe on campus?
If you are asking me a question, then let me answer
it.
This is not a question for college administrators to decide. It's been decided by the Supreme Court in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969, the last big free speech case. And the upshot of it is that advocating violence is indeed protected speech. And of course, politicians do it all the time. We ought to bomb this country or bomb that country. Advocating violence, that's protected by the First Amendment. What is not protected is inciting violence, imminent violence, destruction, or mayhem. I cannot say, go smash the windows of that liquor store. So here's my point. Anything Gavin McInnes conceivably said or would have said on your campus is protected speech. Now, if you'd taken 10 minutes to Google this, you'd know that. And so there's really not a close call here. What he's doing is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So for you to say that people should be sanctioned,
do you think people should recruit for Al-Qaeda on a college campus?
Well, of course, I'm completely against Al-Qaeda.
Okay, do you think they should be protected by administrators on a campus?
I think people ought to be able to express their political views, no matter how repugnant to you or me or anyone else, as long as they, in accordance with the Supreme Court decision from 1969, are not inciting imminent violence. I believe I'm understanding that correctly, and I think that you should, and I think the college administrators should.
I do believe
understand
that. I absolutely do believe that. But I also believe that there are arguments, there are points to be made that are beyond the pale of responsible dialogue.
Okay.
Right? So, and I think someone coming and saying we should...
name one.
I just did two. Both of which were suppressed, that were not allowed to be discussed in that newspaper, but and which you have not really answered my question either. My stand is this. Okay, that we do not live in a society in which any speech should or is guaranteed. Okay, so. And I also believe, I was sitting on a subway on the way here, right? And I was sitting on a subway in New York City, and I invite all your listeners to come to and sit in a subway station in New York City, where you sit with a cross-section of humanity that is amazing. And I was wondering, and you know what quote came to my mind? Right? We believe, right, that all men are created equal. This is a founding
You're starting to lose me. You're starting to lose me here, Mr. Ismaili.
Let me get to it. We believe that all men are created equal. When someone likens people of color to monkeys, that resonates for some people to be beyond the pale of acceptable American values, right? Because if our country is based on the idea that we're all equal, then you cannot, right, have an argument about whether some people are below human. That to me is not something that really belongs in a debate on a campus.
You don't like it, and I don't either, and I think that's an awful sentiment, and I would never defend it. And yet both of us are bound as Americans to defend the right of people to express views that we disagree with, even if we consider them repugnant or wrong. If they are short of inciting imminent violence, we have to say, I disagree with you, here's the counter case, here's why you're wrong, here's why you shouldn't say things like that. But we cannot prevent people from expressing what they believe. That is the essence of our democratic values, the ones you appealed to, and you don't seem to understand that.
So you would stand up for someone who actually wants to recruit for an organization that has said they want to hurt the United States. You would stand up for the right of that person to speak on a college campus. College campuses are not American society. College campuses are specific places where people are debating and talking to each other.
Right? They're debating, except when they disagree with you, in which case you write them out of the protection by saying they're somehow beyond the pale. Now, I'm asked you clearly, what about Gavin McInnes's positions is so far outside the mainstream that it doesn't fall under the First Amendment?
Calling an African American a monkey, that should be on the outside of a sane debate.
Okay.
All right.
I'm not saying
and the point is that if someone like that, the point that I made in the editorial is the Republican students need to bring conservative ideas onto campus. We need to know why there should be the deregulation of Wall Street. We need to have a discussion about why there should be deregulation of environmental regulations.
You're conservative? Why is it up to you to define what conservative ideas are?
I believe in real discussion.
But only within your terms.
But the Republican students, instead of bringing that question on campus, they bring someone outside of the pale of any rational discussion who calls
I'm going to do
an African American a monkey.
Okay,
that's
first
what
of all,
Republican students
keep
bring on
campus.
That.
Hold on, wait, stop. I don't want to get into a defense of a specific writer's writings, but I would actually challenge you to cite chapter and verse on that. I don't believe he actually said that. If he did, obviously I find that repugnant.
There's a link. I put the link where I got that information. There is a link. I mean, listen, you're asking me for chapter and verse. Is a link to him speaking where he likens an actress, a black American actress, to a monkey. And
well, there's literally no chance I would defend something like that. But the point is, I would defend the right of anybody to say something I disagree with, and you ought to too, and especially as a college student, and I think you're still a college student.
I'm a graduate student, and I actually
You're
teach.
a graduate student, you teach, then you're in a world that was created specifically to protect people who have non-mainstream opinions.
But that space does not protect everybody. Let's be clear about that.
Apparently it doesn't. It doesn't protect people you disagree with.
Does it protect people who advocate killing cops? Do you think that will go well? If someone wanted to go and speak on a college campus,
first of all,
a tour that said that talked
the time.
Really? I really want to know. I really want to know where there's anybody.
Have you been to a Black Lives Matter protest?
Absolutely not. I support Black Lives Matter. I would never support Black Lives Matter if they advocated killing a police officer.
Really?
And they do not.
I wish
that is
we
a
had the tape. We've only played it like 5
That is a distortion.
Okay, but
right.
Look,
so that doesn't have the point being that your La La Land of college campuses being open to everybody to say whatever they want doesn't exist because we have a criteria, right? Look, we believe for 200 years that all men are created equal.
Well,
let me finish this thought.
Yeah.
Okay. People who come out and say, no, some people aren't equal. Women are inferior when it comes to this. Blacks are inferior when it comes to that. Muslims are inferior because people who say that they go against the grain of a lot of people who get very angry at that. Right?
Yeah, people get angry. That's right. And maybe they should get angry.
And
but
that inflames. That takes us outside of a rational rational discussion.
Okay,
right?
so when people
Republican students, if they want to have a rational discussion on campus, they should have us talk about something that matters.
Okay.
Right? Not bring some
wait,
Yahoo.
Stop, Mr. Ismaili. Can I ask you one last question? We're almost out of time. If I want to know what the new rules are, as created by you, the graduate student, what are the rules for, as you said, rational conversation?
I don't pretend to create
rules. So where
rules.
can I go on the internet to find out what speech is protected and what speech isn't protected, according to you and your friends at NYU? Is there a website
We don't
that tells
make
me?
rules. I don't pretend to make rules,
you keep
and I don't want to be in a position of being administrator of a college. I think it's a very difficult job. That's not what I want to do.
Okay,
but
college
how do I know what the administrators, right, are responsible for the safety of their students on campus. Right, and when someone comes and advocates for this idea, the racist ideas, right, it can hurt people. Right?
Okay,
and the example that I used in my op-ed that you bring up is 2 weeks ago, some guy walks into a mosque, kills 6 people, right? After he heard, and this is documented, after he heard the speech of a far-right politician. Right, so words actually have effect, right?
So if I were to go to a rally and people said, I'm just pulling this out of thin air, pigs in a blanket fry like bacon, about police officers advocating the killing of cops. I mean, you would say that's unacceptable. That should not be allowed. Is that what you're saying? I'm
saying if student group wants to have a discussion about police brutality or racism.
If they were to use that phrase, pigs in a blanket fry like bacon.
I'm not interested in the phrase. I'm not going to debate you over this phrase should be allowed or not.
Because you have no principles. That's why. Because all the things you've been saying for the last 11 minutes are totally untrue.
And I came here because I thought I would get the same respect from you.
You just revealed who you are.
Well,
okay, thanks a lot for joining us. No, you shut it down. Wow. This is Fox News Alert. President Trump says he may issue a new executive order on immigration. That's after 2 legal defeats on his original travel ban affecting 7 countries. The president also told reporters tonight that new executive actions intended to protect national security can be expected next week. For more on that and other events in the Trump White House, we're joined by Fox News correspondent Trace Gallagher. Hey, Trace.
And Tucker, breaking tonight, one of the 29 judges in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, who has not been named, has now requested that the entire court vote on whether to rehear the temporary travel ban case by an en banc panel, meaning a panel of 11 judges. And the court is asking both the Department of Justice and the states of Washington and Minnesota to submit briefs by midday Thursday on whether the case should be reconsidered. The states won the decision, of course, by a 3-judge panel, so clearly they will argue against a new hearing. And earlier, the White House said it would not appeal to an en banc panel or the Supreme Court. And it was willing to go back to district court and fight it out there. Then later, the White House changed position, saying it may yet decide to file an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court. But now, if the Ninth Circuit is potentially offering a new opening, the White House position could change again. Regardless, President Trump says by Monday or Tuesday, he may sign a brand new executive order on immigration that would be almost identical to the order that was just shot down by the courts. Here's the president on Air Force One. Watch.
Could very well be, but I'd like to keep you, I'd like to surprise you. We need speed for reasons of security, so it could very well be that we do that.
What are some of the changes that you're looking for?
Very little, just in honor of the decision. We will perhaps do that. We'll see, but on Monday or Tuesday.
We should note the president's comments aboard Air Force One came before the Ninth Circuit just made this announcement. So, again, things could change. Meantime, the president and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are now at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida for a working weekend of golf. Today, the 2 leaders held a joint news conference where Mr. Trump backed way off his campaign pledge to force Japan to pay for U.S. security. At the time, Trump accused Japan of taking advantage of U.S. security and stealing American jobs. Today, the president said the bond between the 2 nations and the friendship between our 2 peoples runs very, very deep. Tucker.
Trace Gallagher reporting live. Thanks a lot, Trace. Up next, modern college campuses seem hostile to a lot of people, but especially hostile to the mere concept of white men. How bad are things? We'll talk to someone who's literally written the book on that question. Also, segregation is back in vogue. This time it's the left saying they won't live with Trump supporters. We'll tell you where they're expressing that view. Stay tuned. Well, if you've been awake at any point in the last 50 years, you know that American colleges are basically pretty liberal. But in the past 5 years or so, campuses seem to have been hit by a fever they haven't experienced since the 1960s. Instead of focusing on professional skills or the sweet treats of scholarship, millions of students and professors have made far-left politics their only reason for being at school. The result is this: everybody gets a safe space except white men. They are hated and despised. What is this about exactly? Scott Greer is the author of a new book that considers it. It's called No Campus for White Men, and he joins us in the studio. Scott, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So the hysteria level's rising. That's not my imagination. I went to college at one point. It wasn't like this. What's changed?
Well, what's changed is that over the last 5 years, and it actually extends longer to that, but it's really gravitated toward in the last 5 years, is that identity politics and victimhood culture have taken over higher education. Basically, with the 2 points is identity politics stress that basically all a person should care about is their own narrow group interests and the identity they ascribe to themselves, such as, if I'm an African-American man, that's all my politics, and I only care about furthering the interests of my specific group, African-Americans.
Right.
And that's become dominant on campus because they encourage it through affirmative action and other procedures that encourages people to gravitate towards specific identities for more benefit. And then second, and more important is, in some ways, is victimhood culture, where everybody kind of competes to be the biggest victim. And a lot of people are like, well, why are all these young people trying to pretend to be victims? Nobody wants to be a victim, but the reason why they do that is because we assign moral status in the college moral culture that's being created to who's the bigger victim, who's more oppressed, who's more oppressed gets more status in that moral hierarchy created. And if you're privileged, then that's the worst thing that can happen. And say, like in older moral culture, if you're like demonically possessed, that's the lowest. With this, it's like if you're privileged, that's the worst thing you can be, but being a victim is the best thing you can be. But when your victimhood isn't assigned based on socioeconomic status, you can be the son of a poor coal miner from West Virginia, and you're privileged, and you can be the son of a wealthy multimillionaire, but African American, and you're oppressed, and that's how the system works.
Now, there's so many ironies in all this. I mean, I guess the first one you sort of noted. I mean, everyone in college is privileged by definition. They're not working for a living. They're learning, which was considered a privilege for like 1,000 years. And the second point is that colleges were designed to be places where people studied universal truths and values rather than narrow and sectarian ones. Why the change? Like, what brought this about? How did it get here?
Well, it is that it wants to pertain to these narrow interests, as I write in No Campus for White Men. It's about building. It's about It's about trying to get to the right views of these people.
Right.
It's trying to, if you have a narrow identity politics, if that's the core being of the political message on campus, it's trying to please that type of system. So when you have an English course, the fact that Shakespeare and John Milton are the primary writers that are studying that course, that's a problem because they're white males. We need to have more diversity there because of identity politics. People are like, well, I feel left out because I'm reading Shakespeare or John Milton, even though they forget the universal message in those works,
right,
and the message and the great writing. They instead, well, we need to have somebody that reflects this current campus culture that we have. So that's why they kind of they push these type of things on college campus.
You know, I believe everything you say. I don't fully understand the psychology behind it or where it came from, but here's what I know for sure. It doesn't make you happy. We have a video from Yale. I think this is one of the exchanges that precipitated your book, that inspired you to write this. This is a Yale professor, and this is kind of what a lot of them are like. We can roll this.
Your position as master, do you understand that? Then
no, I don't agree with that.
Then why the you accept the position?
Because
who
I have
hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you
Well,
understand
that's just textbook hysteria, but it's also an expression of deep unhappiness. I mean, what was that about?
Absolutely. And that, as you said, that inspired No Campus for White Men. That was about because the professor who was defending himself, who was surrounded and kind of undergoing an inquisition, his wife wrote a simple column saying, look, you shouldn't get all bent out of shape about cultural appropriating Halloween costumes. We know how terrible those can be. I mean, that's a real horror in our society if somebody dresses up in a Halloween costume that's considered cultural appropriation. And she merely said, like, look, you're college kids, you're going to do stupid things, just let it be, don't get out of shape about it. But that was like the worst thing that ever happened on this campus. It was like somebody wrote this horrific racist letter to the newspaper. That's how students treated it. And they took out all their anger upon this poor professor, who's actually a liberal himself, who actually sympathized with their cause, but they wouldn't even let him get his viewpoint heard. They just screamed at him and vented their anger. And it was all kind of this ritual humiliation that he was undergoing. And it was really quite shocking when it happened. And that's why it caught the national eye.
It's just so bizarre. Standing on this bucolic, leafy campus in New England Fall, 60 grand a year. None of them have jobs, and they're angry. It's so weird. No Campus for White Men is the book. Scott Greer is the author. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Democrats have been invoking the name of Coretta Scott King a lot this week after Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts used a letter that King wrote years ago to suggest that Attorney General Jeff Sessions is a bigot. But Mrs. King wrote another letter back in 1991, one you probably haven't heard a lot about. At the time, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah was trying to repeal sanctions placed on employers who hired illegal aliens. Such a move, King warned, would have, quote, a devastating impact on less skilled African-American workers. Mrs. King went on to say the presence of illegal aliens in the workplace would cause, quote, the revival of the pre-1965 discrimination against black and brown U.S. and documented workers in favor of cheap labor, the undocumented workers. Truer words were never spoken or more prescient, but somehow no Democrat has been racing to read that letter. Up next, Betsy DeVos has been Secretary of Education for just a few days, but already a mob surrounded her when she tried to visit a school today. Police are investigating a potential assault tonight. Why are they resorting to violence so quickly? Stay tuned. Well, the ACLU, the American Federation of Teachers, and other enthusiastic defenders of legal abortion have denounced Betsy DeVos, the new Secretary of Education, as, ironically, harmful to the nation's children. One of the most common criticisms of DeVos is that she has no familiarity with public schools. And that did not improve today, as a mass of protesters prevented her from visiting a public school here in Washington and possibly assaulted her. Cops are looking into it now. Watch what happened.
Stop DeVos and fund black futures.
Keep an eye out for the other entrances. I don't think she's
This is when the people don't want all your
too, man.
Keep giving money to senators and buying your way to the position. You should be so proud of yourself. Go back. Shame! 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 Shame!
Wow. What has made these protesters so mad that they'll attack DeVos on her third day? Joined now by Douglas Harris. He's an economics professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. Professor Harris, thanks a lot for coming on. What do you make of that?
Tucker, thanks for having me back. Well, I think the incident today was unfortunate, and I don't think really represents most of the protests. Certainly, there's been a lot of opposition to her, but I think most of it's been pretty peaceful, and I think most of it will continue to be. But I do think it's worth thinking about where it's coming from, why the opposition has been so strong, and why the Senate Democrats went to such lengths to try to stop her. My own take on it from the beginning has been that it is about her ideas, and the idea that a free market in schooling is the best thing for students in the long term. Right. I think that's my take on it. I think the reasons why the opposition have been so strong, I think, are a lot broader than that. I think if you wanted to come up with a resume of things that you probably don't want to see in a Secretary of Education, that's kind of what her resume looks like: the conflicts of interest, the lack of experience in schools, the comments about public schooling as being a dead end. Not having the experience, and then having educators who take their jobs very seriously. They're very passionate about their jobs. I think that's one thing you can see from the last couple of weeks. And then to have somebody with that resume come in and be deemed the education leader for the country is tough on folks.
Right. Well, they're too passionate about the jobs. Saving their jobs is their main concern in a lot of cases. I sent a child to public school here in D.C., and I can tell you that some of the teachers put as their primary interest saving their jobs rather than educating the kids. But I guess, look, you can have a fair debate. You and I have had a fair debate, and an interesting one, and I agreed with some of the things you said about the ideas that Betsy DeVos has about reforming education. But to attack her personally and to say she doesn't care about kids, doesn't care about schools, when she spent like $20 million just to be nice, just not on her own kids, but on other people's kids. Right. And actually, the school that she and her husband have funded in West Michigan has had great results. I mean, I think by any standard, it's kind of worked. Doesn't mean it's applicable to all schools. But it does mean people ought to give her the benefit of the doubt personally, shouldn't they?
Well, I do think she cares, and I think the reform movement often kind of goes off in these different directions on both sides of people saying they don't care. So on the one side, saying that teachers are just out to keep their jobs. The teachers care about their jobs, yes, but they care about kids. And I think at the other side, I think Betsy DeVos cares about kids. I think that she has their interest in mind. I think we just have very different views about what's in their interest. And I think I don't think she's looked carefully at the evidence and really looks at it that way to see whether things are working or not. She has a very strong idea of what she wants to do, and she's going to pursue that seemingly against the evidence.
It just seems like in a normal world, people, including teachers, would look at the test results in Washington, D.C., which is where this happened today, and say, this is so outrageous. I mean, I've got the numbers here. You're familiar with them. 12% of D.C. public school students can pass the math standards. 12%. Why aren't they having protests against that? I mean, that really is hurting people, way more than Betsy DeVos could even devise to hurt somebody. But there are no protests about that. Why?
Well, I think they do oppose that, and they have different ideas on what they want to do. So the alternative approach here would be, and I'm not advocating this, but just trying to summarize the position, that we need more early childhood education, and we need to pay teachers higher salaries and more support. Better buildings. Some of the buildings in Detroit are widely publicized to be falling apart.
Do people really think that after what we did in Kansas City, what we've done here in D.C.? I mean, have you seen some of the schools we have here? My daughter went to one. And, they're unbelievable. They're way nicer than any private school here in their physical plant. And yet, the results are spotty at best. I mean, do people really, with a straight face, argue it's a pure funding formula? The more money you put into it, the better result you get? I just don't think there are any data to show that.
No, I don't think that's what the data show either, but I think there certainly are places where money is an issue, and a lot of what's going on isn't just about the schools either, right? So we have to remember that a lot of the low performance that we're seeing, a lot of that starts and exists when students start the first day of kindergarten, and the schools are trying to catch up from that. So it's not just about the schools, and this is why I think people point to early childhood education as a potential solution, so that they're not so far behind. So I do think that one in particular is a good idea. Do I think that money alone is going to solve this problem within the existing system? No, and that's why my argument hasn't been that we shouldn't do anything differently. It's that we shouldn't go so far in the direction that she's arguing.
Right. Professor, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Up next, more and more people are posting ads for roommates with one peculiar requirement: no Trump supporters allowed. What makes this kind of new segregation better than the old kind? We'll tell you. Plus, in a new poll, a majority of American high school students say offensive speech should not be allowed in public at all. It should be banned. If children are our future, what does that say about our future? We've got details coming up. Well, dozens of people in Washington and around the country are admitting they simply can't bear to live with supporters of the current president. For example, the New York Times reports that a woman called Sahar Khayan was seeking a roommate to fill her $1,300 per month room in Georgetown here in D.C. Her ad read this way: alcohol, pets, and meat products are not allowed in the house. Neither are Trump supporters. Another renter says his home won't welcome Borg, Vorgons, Lannisters, Sith, or Trump supporters, whatever that means. It's not clear whether any of this is illegal. The Fair Housing Act does not ban political discrimination, though D.C. law does. For some reason, instead of calling this what it is, housing discrimination, the New York Times labeled these ads, quote, a small act of defiance, apparently part of the resistance. Think they'd use the same words if the politics were reversed? Probably not. Well, a demoralizing new study finds that a majority of America's young people oppose the First Amendment. In a survey of 12,000 high school kids, just over 50% of respondents said people should not be allowed to use any offensive words in public. An even larger percentage said people should not be allowed to make offensive statements on social media. The blunt question, are we doomed? John Sotsky is the Director of Strategy and Assessment at the Knight Foundation, which commissioned the survey there for the First Amendment, thank heaven, and he joins us now. John, is there any reason not to be really bothered by this? Isn't one of the key things you learn in school as an American that our country is predicated, among other things, the First Amendment? But they don't seem to have learned that.
Well, first off, good evening, Tucker. Thanks for having me. I think there's some bright lines around the findings themselves. We find that actually in the 12 years that we've been doing this survey to test the attitudes of high school students towards the First Amendment, support on some metrics has never been higher. 91% of students agree that people should be allowed to express unpopular opinions. But as you're referring to, when you start to ask them about, or should people be allowed to express opinions that are offensive, then support starts to dip.
Oh, it doesn't just dip, it goes below 50. The majority says no. And so how can you be for the First Amendment if you don't think that people should be allowed to say things you disagree with?
It's a great question. So I think one hypothesis is that students don't truly appreciate what the First Amendment is, and that part of the First Amendment isn't a right not to be offended. But the other aspect here is that I think increasingly, whether it's through media segmentation, whether it's through social networks, people are self-identifying into tribes. They're like-minded, and they're not exposed to the opinions of others. And I think that's increasing a lack of tolerance to hear viewpoints that are not ones that they're accustomed to encountering through the networks that they travel in.
And they're kids, and so they're judgmental and lacking wisdom and all the things that go along with youth, in addition to good health and optimism. I guess what's really striking, though, is teachers agree with them. So according to your survey, and thank you again for doing this survey, almost half of teachers, adults in charge of our kids, agreed. 53% agreed that you have the right to exercise your First Amendment rights, but 47% said you don't. So how did that happen?
You know, adults tend to be slightly more supportive of First Amendment issues. In this case, the discrepancy is not that much. It's always funny. There's always one question about whether students should be allowed to publish whatever they want in the school newspaper. That's the only one where students are more supportive of First Amendment rights than teachers are.
Right.
But for the most part, that's right. But generally, it's pretty close, and it shows you we can't just ascribe this to a younger generation's views. This is actually a fairly common held view, and when you start to dig deeper into First Amendment attitudes, even internationally, you find when you ask questions that are about offensive free speech, support dips noticeably.
But, I mean, you don't see this as a crisis? So the people teaching, so we go to work and we leave our kids in the care of adults who we believe are making them better people, but it turns out that almost half of them don't believe in the First Amendment, which is like the bedrock of American life, culture, civilization. So it makes us different. It's what we have of value. And they don't believe in that? Like, shouldn't we do something about this? Like, teach them?
Well, civics education is certainly one course, but I think it's not just a matter of teachers. And what you find in the survey is this isn't about blue states or red states. This is 12,000 students and nearly 1,000 teachers who are surveyed across all states in the country. So this is an issue that we're encountering across the board, and really thinking about how we become more tolerant of other viewpoints.
You know as well as I, because you do the surveys, that support for the First Amendment is noticeably higher among conservatives than among liberals. And that kind of jumps right out.
I haven't seen that. I think it's an issue that that really spans the spectrum. Quite frankly, I think whether it's incidents in Berkeley, which I know you've covered on your show recently, or people upset about Colin Kaepernick's gestures earlier in the year, I think you find outrage on both sides when it comes to different forms of freedom of expression.
Outrage is fine. You're allowed to be outraged. You're not allowed to prevent other people from saying what they think. Maybe that's the distinction. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Up next, an economist says he's got a way to improve the lot of America's poor, guarantee everybody a job from the government of at least $23,000 a year. Could it be that easy? He joins us after the break. Americans possess a lot of rights, and the number is growing. The Constitution guarantees the rights of free speech, free religion, and the right to bear arms. Judicial alchemy has created brand new rights, such as abortion, gay marriage, etc. Is it time for yet another, the right to a job? That's what economist Mark Paul is arguing. In a recent column for the Jacobin magazine, Paul says the government ought to offer a job guaranteed, paying at least $23,000 a year to anybody who wants one. He says this would permanently fix the problem of the working poor. Is it madness or brilliance? Maybe both? Professor Paul joins us tonight from Raleigh, North Carolina. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
I'm not here to attack you. I think there is a huge problem as we transition out of an industrial economy with what people do for a living, and clearly we've left a lot of people behind. The first thing that bothers me about your idea, though, it does seem like giving up. It feels like admitting that some people are never going to be integrated into whatever the new economy is. They can't succeed, so let's just put them on the dole, in effect. Is that what it is?
Absolutely not, Tucker. First of all, thanks for having me on. But I have to say, I couldn't disagree with you more on this fact. I believe strongly in American workers. But what I think is, right now, the market is failing far too many. Americans that are unemployed or looking for full-time work and simply can't find it. I think that anybody who wants to work should be able to find a job, and that's what this program does. And when you talk to employers, what do they want? They want an educated and skilled workforce. How do workers build skills? They build it through working. Talk to employers, one of the biggest problems they have is the fact that they don't want to hire people that are unemployed. Let's put people to work. Let's help them build skills. Best way to acquire those skills is on the job. And through this type of program, we could really be rebuilding our infrastructure, which will also help private businesses exceed and expand.
See, I don't think anything you've said is crazy at all. And so again, I'm taking you seriously because I think there is a problem, and you've identified it, and God bless you for doing it. With it, though, is that people will not work unless there's an incentive to. I won't. I'd sit around all day if I didn't have to work. And so what's the incentive for people to take these jobs? Would you eliminate current welfare programs?
No. First of all, 15 million Americans, again, want to work. They're actively seeking employment, and the private market is not providing them. You're going to tell me that those 15 million Americans don't want to work? I'm sorry, but there's plenty of Americans that want to work and simply can't find jobs right now.
So what jobs are these? Where do they come from?
Hold on a second there. Right now, there are 4 job openings for every 10 workers seeking employment. There's simply not enough jobs for these workers. So it's not about people not wanting to work. It's about the market not providing adequate employment for these workers. This program will do that. So now you asked me about the types of jobs. Plenty of types of jobs. I mean, Americans walk outside of their front door every day and see plenty of things that we could be investing in as a society. Building schools, building roads, creating high-speed rail. Right now, we're living in a 20th century economy. We need to update. President Trump has been continuously talking about being the jobs president. He wants to rebuild America's infrastructure. You know what? I would like to, too, and this type of program could provide the labor for that type of program.
Right, but you've got to get immigration under control, because $23,000 a year is higher than the per capita income of over 150 countries, including the biggest countries, China, Brazil, Russia, India, Mexico, which is right there. If you don't shut the borders, you would have a massive influx of people coming here to take advantage of a guaranteed $23,000 a year, obviously. What would you do about that?
No, right now we're talking about providing jobs to citizens. In some ways, there's shortcomings with that, but right now this is a program to put Americans back to work. We already see legislation that's been put forth that is similar to my idea by Congressman Conyers. And the legislation applies to American citizens that are seeking a job. There are 15 million of them that would like to work, and I would like to put them to work. This type of program can do that. And, when you're talking about what types of jobs these are, again, we could be investing in human skills, too. Let's talk about things like universal child care. Let's talk about taking care of the elderly. There's plenty of jobs that can be done. And if, we can't think of those jobs, I think that's a failure of our imagination rather than the fact that there's not sufficient work to be done in this country.
I tend to agree with you there. I guess my last sort of skeptical instinct comes from the fact that I'm around government workers all the time. My dad was one. Some of them are great, but some of them treat their jobs like they're a joke. Go to the DMV. That's a real thing. You go there, you know that. They don't take their job seriously. And so why wouldn't these 15 million workers in new government jobs have the same attitude?
I think that people genuinely want to work. There's a tremendous amount of dignity to work, and that these individuals, if given an opportunity, I'm a firm believer that folks will want to work, will do a good job, will, be productive members of our society. We simply want these people to contribute to our society. They want to contribute. We want to let them contribute.
All right.
But right now, they're not given a fair share of doing that, a fair shot at doing that, and this program can give them just that.
I agree with your aim. We're out of time. Professor, thank you. Coming up, you saw the riots in Berkeley last week. A powerful new letter diagnoses the moral rot that caused them. We'll share it with you next. Well, if you saw that mob of violent young leftists setting fires outside of UC Berkeley last week, the obvious question may have occurred to you. What's going to happen to these people when they grow up? Will they embrace reality and responsibility and the bourgeois values that produce stable, happy societies? Well, as it happens, our friend Rod Dreher at the American Conservative received a letter recently from a reader who is pondering that very thing. Her conclusion? Don't bet on it. Her name is Annie, and here's part of what she wrote. Quote, "The power of the meritocratic society gives our untitled aristocrats a belief in the rightness of their rule through the power of resume and college credentialing. They can jet to Southeast Asia for a semester, volunteer in South America for a year, travel to Turkey twice in a year, and never think at all about their carbon footprint. They dine out more than any generation ever has, but they vote the right way and never think about warehouses or trucking lines. They're the children of neoliberal boomers and they stand to inherit their parents' and grandparents' wealth and power. They criticize the faces of that power while embracing the underlying premises. It's an enormous mistake to think they're going to grow up and accept things. I know too many of them. They are the Obama bureaucrats still in their jobs, the lawyers in California mid-level institutions, the doctors, the foreign correspondents. They are revolutionaries, but the revolution strangely keeps all wealthy urbanites like themselves in their real simple lifestyles. It's a revolution forced upon the lower classes that gets corporations to signal their allegiance. The colleges are at the center of this revolution for a reason. They give the credentials. If the kids ever start rejecting the college system, then we'll know something has changed. This is the toxic rot of meritocracy. We are watching the scions of the upper middle class and the wealthy justify their rule to themselves and to us through a progressive status politics that leaves the poor rotting on drugs, jobless, fatherless, hopeless. It almost makes you long for an aristocracy where power was an accident of birth, where there were reciprocal obligations. Interesting that the gap between the rich and the poor has never been greater than the global meritocracy. And there it is. And that's about it for us tonight. Tune in each night at 9 to the show that is the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. Be sure to set your DVR for the show if you haven't already. And be sure to watch Sean Hannity. He's up next. Have a great weekend.